Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk about religion in general, and I would like to briefly go over the Western religions. So one of the things that we want to understand is how does religion affect society in terms, and we've talked about this a little bit before when we were talking about rituals, right? This is a continuation of that conversation, so we've actually already talked about that. But how does religion manifest physically, right? So sacred architecture, structures, rituals that go with each religion. And then the College Board would like you to understand the 5 big religions. And so we're going to divide those up into Western and Eastern, and we'll talk about those over 2 different days just to give you an idea of where we're going for this. But those will all be brief in these lectures, and then I have information sheets for you so you can study those. Okay, so let's get started. First of all, we are not sure that we're the only human to actually have had religion, right? Definitely Homo sapiens, we find grave goods and we find Paleolithic rock art, and so there is ancient evidence of belief in an afterlife and belief in some sort of supernatural governing power, whether that is the spirits of the animals, an animistic kind of a thing in terms of the hunting. But what's interesting about the cave art is that in some places we actually see that animals have been drawn over animals, and so one could imagine a situation in which you would ask the divine, right, this power outside yourself, for success and safety in hunting, perhaps, right? Another interesting thing about the cave art, just to point out that ancient humans are the same as we are, a lot of the cave paintings that you see actually use the topography of the rock itself to give the drawings a 3-dimensional feel. And so you'll have a bulge in the rock where the shoulder of a deer is, right? Or, whatever animal happens to be there. And it's a very cool statement about the fact that we have always been artistic. And one of the things that separates us from other primates is our art and the fact that we do it, right? So that's kind of an interesting thing too. But it plays a huge role in religion. Now, as far as the grave goods, those do indicate a belief in the afterlife. Why would you need all of these things if you didn't need them later, right? And of course there's the idea of offerings and making someone comfortable, but again that indicates some sort of spiritual component. And of course we'll never know exactly what that is. Now we have found pollen and pine boughs and things like that that indicate that Neanderthal was also being buried, not with tools. They weren't buried with tools, and they had tools, they had sophisticated tools, but they were being buried with offerings of some sort, whether it was to make that person comfortable, to help them move on to the next life, to a sense of the divine. We will never know what that is, but the fact is that there was something going on there. All right, and then of course there's the idea of the Homo naledi burials, which you can ask me about in class. And we'll talk about all that later on. But moving on, let's talk about architecture, because one of the big fundamental central pieces of religion is, where do you worship? And so when we talk about sacred architecture, we're talking about the buildings of the gods. And the construction of these sites will incorporate all of the things that signify and or are important to the divine, right? Sometimes they're supposed to represent what's happening immediately in the community. And so this is a special place. It's like a little microcosm. It's a conduit to the divine. And sometimes that conduit is represented by what we call exotic things, things from somewhere else. And if you think about a lot of the prehistoric or like agricultural revolution, not even that, just the pre-modern religion, modern religious structures, pre-religion, they oftentimes are built with stuff that is complex, ornate, and very far away, right? Most of the time, it's your religious structures that are the largest structures in landscape, and we're going to come back to this too, right? And we'll talk about that later on. Most of them require the participation of the entire community, and sometimes even multiple communities that will share this structure to build, right? You have to have lots of people working. And some of the earliest sacred sites that we see are circles and mounds. Stonehenge, of course, is the most famous of those. Stonehenge is between 4,000 and 5,000 years old. It is made from stones that were carried a significant distance, and like most early sacred sites, it has an astronomical tie to it. We don't know who built it. We actually don't know who built it. We don't know what it's for, but we do know that there are other hinges. There are mounds. This is actually a huge complex. There are mound structures all over the Salisbury Plains and the surrounding area. And we know that there are processional routes. We know that there were other hinges. Some of those hinges were made of wood. So when you're looking at the people who built these, they built wood hinges and they built stone hinges, right? And hinge is just a circle of stones or wood. We think that the wood related to the living, and that the stone might have related to the dead. And we're not sure, but that is one hypothesis. And so it's possible that Stonehenge was related to passing on to the next life. We don't know, right? But that is one of the hypotheses about that. And circles are not rare. Circle is a really important shape. The circle of life, the wheel of life, the spiral of history, right? Circles we find everywhere. This is a circle in Wyoming. It is actually a medicine wheel, which is a Native American structure, and in this case, a lot of times you'll see them drawn, but there are also a lot of these big circles, these big medicine wheels in the ground, right? Same idea. Now, other sacred sites include caves, and I'll talk about mounds in just a second, but caves really oftentimes special, right? You don't come across caves very often, and these are both cenotes. This is actually also out of a cenote. Cenotes in particular, oh, and this one is too. This is a cave underneath. You can see the cenote opening over here. This goes directly up to the ground, so the ground's up here. Cenotes are some of the most famous sacred caves. They're all over Mexico. They are left from the asteroid impact, the Chicxulub asteroid impact, that extincted the dinosaurs. So they've been around for millions and millions of years, 65 million years, and they play a big role as passages to divine realms, the realms of the dead, things like that. And sometimes when we don't have big elaborate natural caves, we will turn caves into elaborate caves. The interesting thing, these are the Ellora caves in India, and you can see they are all carved out. There are all sorts of wonderful ornate carvings that are all very meaningful. An interesting thing about caves is they are thought to represent the womb, right? When you go into the cave, it is as if you are going back to the womb of the earth, the Mother Earth, right? And then you are reborn when you exit the cave in your new state, whatever that may be. Because remember, anytime you're doing a ritual, you have that separation, that metaphysical transformation, and then the reemergence back into society. And caves give you a very good physical way to do that. Now, again, back to some of these older structures. If you don't have any caves at all, you could make caves, right? And so we see a lot of mounds all over the world. Some mounds have things in them. In the case of Newgrange, you actually go into a small passage here, right? There's a wood hinge, by the way, right here. You go into this small passageway, and in the center of this mound is a little opening, and it's got this dome roof that's set with stones, and then the mound itself is built around it. And the internal chamber is not very big. There are a couple of offshoots of that where we think that people might have stored bones. We don't really know, again, what this is for, but this is a very elaborate structure, and all of these dark stones that you see in the outside here were carried from a fairly significant distance. So again, you have this exotic addition into the structure to show intent, effort, and reverence for the gods. And then here are some more mounds here in the United States. These were made by prehistoric Americans, and you can see they're sizable. This is a snake. we think, right? And so you can see the serpent winds through, and then here you have another large mound that you can climb to the top of. I don't think there's anything in it actually. It's just a structure, and it was built over a long period of time. And you see this a lot. You'll start out with a simpler structure, and the Stonehenge was built this way too. Start out with a simpler structure, and then the community keeps adding to it. And when you start talking about big structures, I mean, these are big, but when you think really big, let's think about pyramids. And when you think about pyramids, you think about the Egyptian pyramids, right? The big three, especially the pyramids of Giza, these are the most famous, and they are huge. They took thousands of people, years and years to make, but they are not the oldest of pyramids. We can find more pyramids that are older. Actually, in Sudan, there's a ton of pyramids. And the earliest pyramids, and actually the large pyramids underneath, are these step structures. And eventually people figured out that they could plate them on the side to make these really smooth structures. But here you can see this may have had plating on it to make it a smooth structure, but some of them don't. And actually, when you move over to the New World in Central America, you'll find that the pyramids actually are the step structure, which is what gives it stability, of course. And we will talk more about the Pyramid of Kukulkan in Mexico because it has a very, very special function at the solstice, right? And so we'll talk about that later on. And you can see here these pyramids. So pyramids are a big deal. Here are some pyramids in Peru. This is heavily eroded, right? This is a pyramid, actually. Heavily eroded, but still there. So pyramids. So when we review, we love circles, right? That represent the circle of life. We have caves, Mother Nature's womb, this secret closed space that opens up into someplace else. And we have pyramids that point to the sky, the sun, the moon, the heavens, right? And so you can see that these shapes resonate and are created in multiple cultures, right? And all of these, in some ways, are like temples, right? And, of course, when we start building structures, that's what we are building. Here is a beautiful temple. They are huge. You can see these gorgeous columns, right, that hold up the roof. This, of course, is ruins, but this is what we go from as we are building these large structures. Then we start to make homes, essentially, of gods, and that's what the temples are. And here, of course, is the Parthenon, right? And then this is a replica of the statue. This is also a rebuild. This is a replica of the statue that would have been in the Parthenon. That's Athena. So you can see that over time we transition, but one thing that is true is that we want large, ornate, difficult structures to show the gods that we deserve whatever it is that we are asking for. All right, so when we talk about religions in general, there are basically three big classifications. There are the monotheistic religions, they worship a single deity. There are the polytheistic religions, they have more than one deity, sometimes thousands. If you think about Hindu religion, they have thousands of gods or versions of gods. And then there are the animistic religions, and these are the ones that believe that everything has a spirit. So basically we're talking about your nature spirits. All right, and then we can divide in another way, right, religions in terms of how they deal with members of the religion. They're universalizing religions. They seek converts. They will go out and convert people to their religion. And then we have ethnic religions. These are the ones that you are born into. They are not seeking converts. They are not out proselytizing, things like that. They sometimes don't even accept converts, actually, right? You have to be born into the religion. In some cases, you can become that religion, but most of the time you have to be born into it, right? So how do these differ? Ultimately, a universalizing religion needs to appeal to everybody. It usually has an individual founder, a prophet, oftentimes. The message is diffused widely. You have people who are actively spreading the message of the religion. The followers are distributed everywhere, right, around the world. And you're going to do this in class. You're going to map some religions and see how that works. And then you'll decide whether they are universalizing or they are ethnic, right? And the holidays in universalizing religions are based on the founder's life as opposed to natural phenomenon in the area, because they're so widely spread. You don't have universal natural phenomena. Okay. Lots of them. I mean, there are like winter solstice, summer solstice, everybody's got those, right? Now, in ethnic religion, they have meaning in a particular place. They have meaning in a particular geography, right? Oftentimes there's an unknown source. It's just always been that way. The content is focused on the geography of the area and on the people who live in that area. The followers are highly, highly clustered. Even if you find them in other parts of the world, it will be with enclaves of people who come from whatever that ethnic background is. And the holidays are based on the natural phenomena, like monsoons, for instance, or lightning storms, or whatever, right? And a lot of times you'll see that they reflect agricultural practices, harvest times, planting times, right? Okay, so when you think about religions in general and organized religion, there are branches, and then within the branches there are denominations, right? And I will give you an example of these later on. And then within the denominations, you can get sects that actually break off from a major denomination, and so these are small sort of subculture groups. And that's true for most religions, actually. Most religions have branches, denominations, and sects. All right, so just looking at a general map, here's some of the major religions of the world, and this is where you find them. We will, of course, talk about Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Buddhism, and Hinduism as the big five, right? So when we think about Western versus Eastern religions, Western religions are religions that developed west of the Urals. Judaism, Christianity, Islam, right? The Baha'i, Zoroastrianism, those are two more that are widely practiced that are also Western religions. They are not Abrahamic. Judaism, Christianity, and Islam are all Abrahamic religions. All right, in Eastern, they are developed east of the Urals. And so we find, like India, we have Hinduism, Buddhism, Sikhism, Jainism. In the Far East, we will have Taoism, Confucianism, Shinto, and also Buddhism. Okay? So this is kind of to give you an idea of how we're organizing things. We could spend the rest of the course talking about religion and never talk about all the different religions in the world. But here's a quick conversation about the Western religions, in particular the Abrahamic religions. The oldest of the three is Judaism. It is monotheistic and is an ethnic religion. It is also matrilineal, which is an interesting thing. They live in accordance with the covenant of God. The sacred text is the Torah, right? And their sacred site is Jerusalem. And this is an interesting thing because Jerusalem is a sacred site to many people, right? They abide by the 13 principles of faith, which were recorded by Maimonides, who is, well, you can read lots of things. We'll talk about that later. Okay. It's very tempting sometimes to go off on little tangents in the video notes, but I'm not going to do that. All right. Okay, and then here are the three branches of Judaism. You have Orthodox, Conservative, and Reform. I've put this table in here so you can kind of see the difference. So here's your first question. I told you we would do this quickly. The two centers of Jewish life today include Israel and what other country? Poland, Russia, the US, or Egypt? It is the United States. The two largest population of Jewish people are Israel and the US. And when we look at the Jewish population distributed around the world, you can see that that is true. And then in the US, we can also see concentrations of the population. And we will talk about this later on when we talk about mapping. All right, when we talk about architecture, so I want to briefly talk about architecture. Each sacred site for each religion will have some fundamental pieces, right? In temples, Jewish temples, you have a central raised platform where the Torah is stored and also where it is read. The Torah is stored in a chest or an ark that usually has very ornate doors, and frequently you will see lions and eagles used to represent the divine within the buildings. And here are two just examples. Obviously, there are exceptions to all of these things, so this is a generalization. Christianity is universalizing and monotheistic. Basic beliefs are the idea that you can achieve salvation through faith in the Holy Trinity and that Jesus is the Son of God, right? The sacred text is the Bible, sacred site also Jerusalem. And then here is basically a summary of what Christians believe in relation to the Trinity, the Holy Trinity. And then Christianity has a lot of branches and denominations. The big branches are Catholic, Protestant, and Eastern Orthodox. And then the Protestant group is divided into bunches of different denominations, and then off of those denominations are a ton of different sects. And so when you start looking at that, you can actually see here's just a list of some of the Christian denominations. It is universalizing, and so we see it arises in Israel and then spreads out all over the world. There is an active spreading of Christianity. And when you look at Christianity in the U.S., you will see clustering of different denominations, and we will talk about this more in class, right? Lots of people in the United States Protestant, but we have a significant Catholic population as well, less Orthodox population. And then in terms of the largest denomination in Christianity, it is Catholicism, and here is where Catholics are distributed around the world. You can definitely see the work of missionaries in this map, and again, we'll talk about this more later on. Here is another map. This is of Protestants. Just distribution. You can see that in the United States and Europe, large population of Protestants. In Christian architecture, we are talking about the church, and the church is supposed to represent the city of God on earth. It is a direct part of worship. The churches are built to glorify God. There's lots of imagery in the churches, stained glass windows, paintings, things like that, and they are all used to teach the gospel, essentially. And oftentimes you'll see a cross design or a dome in churches. Instead of having a single raised platform with the Torah, a lot of times you'll have a pulpit. You'll have an altar, which is similar to what you see in a temple, a Jewish temple. In some cases, you'll have a pulpit as well, and that becomes the dominant feature because it's less about the altar stuff and more about the person who is giving the service. And that's not true in all churches, and it depends on the denomination. Now, there's some exceptions to this whole big idea of the building representing the city of God, and these are my favorite examples. The rock churches of Ethiopia. There are several of these. This is St. George Church, and they are all carved into landscape. And some people assume that it was so people wouldn't see them on the horizon and want to destroy them. A lot of work went into building these, and so you see that same effort, but they're very cool. They are dug directly out of the rock. Very interesting. And Ethiopia is an interesting place in general. There was a large Christian population throughout its history since Christianity reached Africa, and it has one of the only Black Jewish communities in the world here in Ethiopia. And then just here are some more of the rock churches. All right, Islam is universalizing and monotheistic. Its belief system revolves around Sharia law and the 5 pillars of Islam. In Islamic countries today, Sharia law is the law of the country, which is not something that you see in Judaism or Christianity in modern times. The sacred text is the Quran, and the sacred sites, Mecca and Jerusalem. So now we have a conflict in terms of shared holy sites between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and that does not always go well because not all of these groups get along well. Here are the beliefs in Islam, the 5 pillars and the articles of faith. And then Sharia law is a separate thing, and we will talk a little bit about Sharia law later on in the course. So here's your next question. All of the following are true concerning the relationship between Islam and Christianity, except Muslims do not recognize Jesus as God, Muslims do not believe in a triune God, that's a trinity, Muslims recognize the authority of the Old Testament, or Muslims practice baptism but do not celebrate Holy Communion. Muslims do practice baptism, but they do not celebrate Holy Communion. So there are a lot of similarities in a lot of ways between Islam and Christianity, but there are some big fundamental differences. That's true for any religion, actually. Okay. All right. Islam around the world. You'll see that the highest concentrations are in North Africa and the Middle East. Having said that, though, it is a universalizing religion. It is the fastest growing religion in the world. It also has branches and sects. You have the Sunni and the Shia are the 2 big branches. And here's just a map of who lives where. All right, and then in the United States, you can see a pretty big distribution, although there are some concentrations of Muslim communities. And then when you start looking at a comparison, Christianity is still the largest practiced religion in the world. Muslim is second in terms of the, well, actually just in terms of the Abrahamic religions. We'll talk about some others that have large numbers too, but Muslim is the fastest growing, and so as Christianity's growth slows down, you'll start to see them catch up. All right, according to most historians, which of the following were not a cause of the Crusades? The desire of the Church to convert Muslims to Christianity, the growing problems of the Byzantine Empire, the hope of the clergy to divert the warlike activities of the feudal nobles to other interests, or the religious zeal inspired in Europeans by the Reform movement. Ultimately, most historians think it was a desire of the Church to convert Muslims to Christianity, but it's always more complex than that. But ultimately, that's the bottom line, and so the adherents of Christianity and the adherents of Islam have a long history of not getting along together. All right. Islamic architecture. Here we're talking about mosques, and interestingly enough, there is a lot of uniformity in mosques. You see the characteristic domes, you see the minarets, you see geometric shapes and repetitive art instead of pictures. You're actually forbidden to put pictures of Allah, Muhammad, anyone on anything, right? And so you'll see calligraphy and geometric shapes instead. And they all face the same direction towards Mecca. And then here is a very interesting mosque, and I think it reflects very well this idea of having to modify things for geography. Here you can see that we're in the desert, we've made it out of adobe, and the minaret is shorter, right? And you see all of these spiked pieces, in part for protection and in part for decoration and in part to help build the structure itself. Okay, now what about these shared holy sites? Temple Mount is an interesting place because it is the possible site of where Abraham almost sacrificed his son. Okay, it is also the sites of the first and second temples of Solomon, and it has the Western Wall, which is the sacred prayer site, because that is remains of these temples. They are all sacred to Christianity and to Judaism, and it is the Dome of the Rock where Muhammad is supposed to have ascended to heaven, which is sacred to Islam. Fun fact, it was also the headquarters of the Knights Templar, for those of you that know about them. And so we have this big conflict, and so when people cannot agree to worship side by side, then we have wars. And places like this often cause discord because everybody's like, well, it's my holy site, you can't be here, it's not yours. Well, but it's my holy site, you can't be here, it's not yours. And so that is a problem. And this is a problem with religion in general when people start to think of their religion as being the way, and then everyone else is wrong and bad, right? And so that's the kind of negative side, and we'll talk about that more in class too. All right, so here's the religions ranked by size. Christianity and Islam, top two, but then Hinduism is actually the third most practiced religion, with to the tune of about 900 million to a billion adherents. Okay, Judaism, Islam, and Christianity all share a belief in the central authority of the Pope, the prohibition of the consumption of pork, reincarnation and the Four Noble Truths, or monotheism and ethical conduct. A fun fact is that they are all monotheistic, right? They all worship the same God. They have different prophets and different beliefs about those prophets, but they all worship the same God, and they all have a code of ethics that every adherent is supposed to follow. So there are some real commonalities here because they are all Abrahamic religions. They all stem from the same tree. Now, let's talk briefly about fundamentalism and extremism. Fundamentalism and extremism, no matter what you're talking about, always have negative ramifications because this is where you return to these strict dogmas and you don't allow for any sort of conversation about faith. And extremism is about radicalization, and this is fundamentalism carried out to the point of violence. This is where you shift from my religion is better than your religion and I'm right and you're wrong to the only way is my way, and if you don't adhere to my way, then you must be punished or you must be killed, right? And so that's what we're talking about when we talk about extremism and radicalization. Currently, the majority of radicalization around the world happens to exist in Islam today. And this is something we'll talk about later on when we talk about terrorism. All right, so let's talk a little bit about secularization versus fundamentalism. Secularization is a process in which people are moving away from religious beliefs, and this is something that's really happening in urban centers of the United States. It's very common in China, where religion is essentially not promoted and in some cases outlawed. The former Soviet Union, in Europe, right, are all moving away from religious beliefs. Some people still call themselves spiritual, but they don't adhere to any sort of organized religion, versus fundamentalism, which we're also seeing a shift towards in the United States and in the Islamic nations, where you're having a return to everything controlled by religious law and following those religious ethics. And these things do not go well together, and they don't allow for moderation. And so that's an important thing. They also tend not to allow for tolerance of each other, and that is also an issue. So here's some fun facts. Christianity is the largest religion in the world. Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world, followed by Judaism, and then Buddhism, then Christianity, and then Islam. Muslims worship on Friday. The Jewish population worships on Saturday, and the Christian population worships on Sunday. There are 3 branches of Christianity, 2 branches of Buddhism, 2 branches of Islam, 4 branches of Hinduism, and 3 branches of Judaism. So those are all just some fun things to know. All right, so form follows function is something that we talk about in biology all the time, but we also talk about it in terms of climate and geology and geography, all of those things. So looking at modern architecture, remembering what the function of these buildings, the functions are, right? When we look at modern architecture, we see this very interesting shift. Here's a church. It's clean, it's modern, it's not ornate, and yet it's still supposed to be the city of God on earth. So what does this say about the way people have changed, right? You can see here that you've got this minaret, you've got the dome, but they're both relatively understated. You have no ornate structures. Both of these features are kind of that modern and postmodern utilitarianism view. Like, for instance, this is actually a center for art. The building itself, not particularly artistic when we think about art. It's very functional, very postmodern. And postmodern is less about this ornate and beautiful and all of those things, and more about this functional utilitarianism. And here's just some more examples of that shift. And one of the questions that we ask ourselves is, does that change how we view what we are doing when we think about religious rituals, when we think about spirituality, when we think about worshiping the divine? It's a very good question. And we'll come up with this also when we talk about folk architecture. What does it mean about us and our homes and our statements about ourselves on a small scale in addition to this large sacred scale? All right, so that is it. These were a little bit longer because we had a lot to, sorry, I'm trying to find the actual thing there. Okay. So thanks for listening, and thanks for listening a little bit extra, and I will see you next time. Please ask any questions you have in class, and that's it.